The word privilege, as in male privilege, or your privilege is showing, has in recent years become a rhetorical tool to challenge existing power dynamics. And just as it empowers some, others see it as divisive. And that's where writer Phoebe Bovy stepped up with her new book. It's called The Perils of Privilege: Why Injustice Can't Be Solved by Accusing Others of Advantage. And she joins us now for more. Hi, Phoebe.
Hi, Nam. Thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you here. And now the title of your book, Perils of Privilege.
Yes.
I think whenever I hear privilege, I want to be privileged. I want to be, comfortable. But that's not what you're talking about here.
Right. So what I'm talking about is privilege in the sense of systemic advantage. So that could be being wealthy. It could be, so just to say, I'm from the States, so all of this is kind of in a U.S. context. Some of this will apply more to Canada than other aspects of this, but I live in Toronto now. So I'm talking about things that could be being white, it could be being male, it could be being straight, things like that. So that's what I mean in terms of privilege. And when I talk about the perils, I mean the perils of using a privilege framework to talk about oppression.
And where does the concept of privilege come from, this particular privilege that you're talking about?
So it comes, in a sense, from academia and activism. So in part from feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh's checklist that she came up with in the 1980s, where she wrote about, she basically used the way she had felt oppressed as a woman to explain how she imagines people who are not white, as she is, might feel oppressed. So it's this checklist of items. But what I'm talking about is really something that's come out of social media more, that's where people either using things like a BuzzFeed checklist or something assess their own privilege.
And BuzzFeed is the website.
Yes, the BuzzFeed website, where people either share sort of quizzes where they try to figure out how much privilege they have, or where, and I'm talking a lot about people who have similar amounts of privilege to one another, accuse one another. And I use the word accuse intentionally, of saying, like, where one white person says to another white person, one rich person to another rich person, your privilege is showing, in a way that sort of hides their own privilege as well.
And that you use the abbreviation YPIS.
Yes.
And I guess you could also say, check your privilege.
Right, right. The reason I chose to talk about your privilege is showing even more than check your privilege is I think it's the expression that leaves the person who hears it the most confused. Because what does it mean if your privilege is showing? What are you supposed to do? So should you then deny your privilege? Should you just have it? Would it be a better world if you were less obvious in it, or is it? So I think check your privilege is at least saying sort of be aware of it, which makes a little more sense than it's showing.
You write also about privilege awareness. What is that?
So I think that what's happened, and my reason for writing this book, is that there's been too much of a focus on getting individuals intricately aware of their exact level of privilege, which is, I think, futile, because I think it's inherent to privilege that the person who has it isn't really aware of it, or isn't really aware of what it means. And I think there's been too much of a focus on that rather than on fighting for justice and opposing oppression, so that people are very focused often on
the micro
and on the sort of individual idiosyncratic, like, do you really truly understand your privilege? And I think that's a way to get sidetracked. And I think that when it's in conversation, it's a way to, there's always going to be defensiveness and pushback in conversations that are about oppression. I think having the main point be privilege increases the possibility that
Why
happens.
is that? Why is it that people become defensive?
Right. So that, in principle, it should be the opposite, right? Because privilege is just talking about society and how things are, and
because the idea is to try to dismantle this.
Right. So in principle, it's just saying this is how society is structured. Why should somebody get defensive about that? And I think a lot of why it's used has come out of the fact that people often are defensive regardless, and some people are going to be defensive regardless. But I think the reason privilege specifically leads to defensiveness is that it has this, the term has this pre-existing meaning, which is to be wealthy, well-connected, and just generally having it easy. So I think if you tell somebody that they have, say, cisgender privilege, it's true that it's easier in society, all things equal, not to be transgender.
What is cisgender?
So to be not transgender, to identify as the gender you were assigned at birth. I think it's true that that's easier. I think if you say something like, you have cis privilege to somebody, they might think, I'm not rich, I'm not elite, and the vast majority of people who identify with the gender they were assigned at birth are not elite, and they're not wrong in that sense, but they're kind of missing the point in a way that they wouldn't necessarily miss the point if this had been phrased otherwise.
Can you remember the first time that you encountered privilege?
So I saw privilege checking online in blog comment threads, so to blogs like Jezebel or Gawker or things like that. And I wish, for the purposes of my book, that there had been some sort of formative moment where somebody had said to me, Phoebe, your privilege is showing. And I was like, oh, but unfortunately, nothing so dramatic as that ever quite happened. But I would see this playing out a lot in conversations online, and I would just think, and it would often seem that people didn't really know much about one another. And indeed, when I was doing research for this book, and there's an example I give in the book, where a woman is very adamantly accused of white privilege online, and she's Black. And it's like, because people don't know what they're doing online, and things like this happen more often than one might think.
Well, you were called poor little rich girl by one commentator on a blog post you wrote. What was the post about?
Well, so I actually don't know whether I was or whether this was in reference to a picture I had chosen to accompany that blog post that was of a reality TV star, Lauren Conrad, crying.
From the Hills?
From the Hills, crying. So it literally was just, so I have a personal blog, I still write on it sometimes, called What Would Phoebe Do? And I had written, I think, something about unpaid internships, because I think work should be paid, and I still think this, and I thought this years ago too. And somebody had commented under the name Anonymous, so no pseudonym or anything, and had said, poor little rich girl. I have no idea. It was like some sort of Rorschach test or something. Like, I have no idea whether that was about me or somebody else, and
But what did it feel like to see that?
It felt, every sense I have sort of personally of every insecurity, every sense that I don't deserve anything, sort of flooded in a very neurotic way. And I thought, oh my goodness. So I basically responded with a whole checklist where I thought, well, I don't have much money, but I do have this and I don't have that. And I don't think that, and I guess when I look back on that, apart from that, that's probably not the best way to be online. And I think I'm glad that I learned that early on before social media really took off.
Which is what, like to respond or to take things personally?
To take things personally and just to sort of delve into your own insecurities, whatever they may be, when somebody's not, I don't even know if this person had been talking about me. And even if they were, it didn't even make sense, because all I was saying is that interns should be paid, which doesn't seem particularly, anyway. But I think, let's say I delve into my every single nuance of privilege in this way, not privilege in that way. Who's helped, I guess? And it seems like it's too much focus inward, and better that I should leverage what privilege I have in the world than that I try to get some very precise reading on whatever privilege level I might have.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the parts of the book that I found really interesting, you talked a little bit about imposter syndrome.
Yes.
And that when women are writing online and writing essays, they have to feel like they have to, I guess, proclaim their privilege, and it takes away from owning their own agency.
Yes. So I think what's happened so I write in the book about a bunch of feminist essays, and there are essays that I really like by writers I really respect. And so I'm not talking about, obviously there's lots of writing online, some of it's really crummy. I'm talking about really good essays, really thoughtful essays, personal essays by women from a feminist perspective. These essays will often include this sort of disclaimer where the writer will say, I realize I'm writing this as, and then you get a whole list, white, middle class, rich, straight, not necessarily all of those, but whichever apply in that particular case. And I think what ends up happening is, what ought to be happening is there should be just a greater range of voices heard. This sort of weird middle ground where the same voices that are always heard are heard, but with this sort of disclaimer apology, I think is a problem specifically because of this imposter syndrome issue where women are already sort of apologizing. And I think what's happened is that rather than sort of I think it's sort of almost too easy, especially for women of the demographic I'm talking about. So these are generally white, straight, middle class women or upper middle class, somewhere like Brooklyn and New York. It's just sort of already very easy. Like there's just this script for sort of apologizing, which is both sort of bad from a feminist perspective and not especially productive from an anti-racist or anti-oppression perspective either.
Now, when we're talking about this privilege,
yes,
who is the most privileged?
Well, so I think, who do I think is the most privileged?
I guess who everybody thinks is most privileged.
Well, so that's what's so tricky about privilege. There's no answer to who everybody thinks is the most privileged. So for a Trump voter, I am not a Trump supporter at all. I am very, very anti-Trump myself. But for a supporter of President Donald Trump, the most privileged are people who live in cities, people who are sort of cosmopolitan. It doesn't even really matter if they're rich or not. So that's how it's seen on the right. For me, I'm on the left, and I tend to just agree with the general progressive sense of these things. I think white people have it easier than people of color. I think rich people have it easier than poor people. I think able-bodied people have it easier and so forth. I think the general assessment of who is the most and least privileged on the left is not inaccurate. So the point of my book is not to question that aspect of things, if that makes sense.
But if we can't come to an agreement on who is privileged, then what happens online?
Well, I think what happens, and this is not just online, is because there's no real consensus over who's the most and least privileged, things can get very tricky and subjective. So you can have something like Trump showing up on the scene and saying, actually, anybody who supports me is the real victim, and all millions of people buy that. So I think because privilege can be so subjective, it can get kind of unhinged from reality in certain ways.
You write, women shouldn't be dismissed as vapid whiners. White ladies, and you capitalize that, however, are fair game. What do you mean by that?
So this is going to be a tough one to unpack, but basically, I think
vapid, sorry, not vapid.
No, I'm actually not sure how you pronounce it. So basically, I think that two things have happened sort of simultaneously, and when I say have happened, I mean this is over like decades, if not more. So there's, on the one hand, a legitimate critique within feminism, that feminism is not inclusive enough, and that it's pretty much focused on the concerns of somebody like Facebook's Sheryl Sandberg, or even somebody like Ivanka Trump, that it's very much about wealthy, very successful white women wanting to have it all. And that there's been pushback, and not just in the last few years, but for decades, against that type of feminism. And that's good that there's that pushback. However, there's also, at the same time, societal misogyny. And when you're looking online, if you see a comment about, white ladies, is it a feminist critique, or like an internal feminist critique, or is it a white man who hates women, who just is sort of hating women in that way? So that's, I mean, I have a whole chapter on this. It's hard, I don't know which part to...
No, that's a good starting point.
Okay.
Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting.
Yeah.
We had a discussion on checking your privilege on the agenda 2 years ago, and here is tech entrepreneur Sadia Mustafa discussing it. Let's take a look.
The reason why it's viewed as confrontational is because it's often at the tail end of somebody saying, this is my life. I have to negotiate something that you don't give a second thought to every single day of my life. So there's a part of my energy, my effort, my sanity that goes into just normalizing things that other people just walk through. And that's why most of the time when somebody lobs a check your privilege, it is with an undertone of frustration and rage, but it comes from not just that one incident.
That's right.
It is built on, like, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts.
What do you think of what she said?
So I think that clip points to something important about privilege checking, which is, and I address this in the book as well, which is that I think it tends to be, I don't even know if effective is the right word. It makes sense when it's a marginalized person, and marginalized in any number of particular ways, speaking out about their own experiences. I think then it's either as venting, as explanation, it makes sense. The really loud conversation, at least in the States, about where people are checking one another's privilege is not people who have been oppressed in a particular way speaking out about that, but is a sort of argument winner among similarly privileged people, all of whom are sort of vying to be sort of the voice of the oppressed, whether or not the oppressed have wanted that. So I think if you're frustrated by any number of, and so I don't think that something like microaggressions is a myth or something like that. And I think that type of check your privilege is understandable, and even if it doesn't, whether or not it's persuasive is sort of beside the point, because I think people have the right to speak out about their experiences. Where I think it isn't so effective is when it's privileged people checking one another's privilege just kind of to win points.
What about pop culture? How has privilege permeated pop culture?
Basically, what's happened are sort of two interrelated phenomena. There's a new type of journalism that's sort of like a think piece online, quick take criticism that's kind of political, but not in a very deep way. And that has had this kind of symbiotic relationship with new television programs, especially, where articles online will say, does such and such show or such and such TV personality, frequently Lena Dunham, is this person getting it right or not? Is this show getting it right or not? And this isn't so much questions of, which I think are legitimate, of representation and sort of overall offensiveness, but it's more this sort of, well, who was this person's parents? What were the exact conditions of production? Is it punching up or down in each scene? It's just this sort of, and that's the only thing that can be said about certain shows and certain movies and books. And I think what's sort of unfortunate and paradoxical about all this is that the creators who come under fire the most for that type of criticism are the ones who are not white men. And ones who are white men pretty much just get to be considered artists, creators, and outside of a sort of identity framework, which is not great.
Why do you think that is?
I think because racism and sexism are real, and because the privilege framework is about prioritizing awareness over sort of concrete changes. So rather than just focusing on sort of numbers, on who's employed doing what, there's more of a focus on, well, does Lena Dunham really understand her own privilege, which has been the subject of probably hundreds of articles.
And what could you give us an example of an artist of color who's received this kind of criticism?
Mindy Kaling, especially. So from the Mindy Project and also from The Office, her show, which I think is very funny,
Me too.
is often a little problematic. It's often, you know, her character tends to date white men. Her jokes her character on the show, on the Mindy Project, is a bit right-leaning, I would say. And then I remember there's some controversy that I wrote about in the book where she was taken to task for not engaging critics on social media. And why should that be her job? She's a creator, and I don't see, like, Karl Ove Knausgaard discussing on Twitter whether his books are problematic.
And Tina Fey, someone else who's been criticized for not
Yes, so
interacting
Tina
with
Fey has, in her show, The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, her new show, it kind of, a lot of it kind of plays off of that and becomes kind of an I don't know, it becomes a think piece of its own that's a bit sort of, it sort of shares my politics, but I also think it's sort of unfortunate when shows seem more like think pieces. And I think that that's a requirement that isn't really, if it's just a show by and about white men, I don't feel like it gets that same pressure.
Is it possible to criticize a movie or a TV show without viewing it through a privileged lens anymore?
I mean, I think everybody is always going to be a product of whichever time they're in. And I personally find if I'm watching a show from a long time ago, things will jump out at me as being offensive that I wouldn't have necessarily noticed as a child. But I think it's possible to have a discussion that is not just about that aspect of a program.
We have one more clip, and this is from Jonathan Kay, writer, again, about the privileged conversation we had on 2 years ago. Let's see.
To a certain extent, a lot of the argument that we're having about white privilege and political correctness is part of a culture shift. And for the most part, it's a welcome culture shift. I think some of the excesses that you see on university campus, some of the excesses you see in identity politics, some of the excesses you see in social media, especially Twitter, I mean, they go too far. But for the most part, the movement to become aware of white privilege is part of a welcome and long-awaited recognition that there are people in society who just every day face casual discrimination at school, in the workplace, and in their neighborhood.
Is privilege awareness part of a broader cultural shift?
It certainly is, but I'm not sure that, and maybe this is me being from the States impacting my thoughts on this, I don't see us as in the States having moved in a positive direction in general. I think there's been a tremendous racist backlash in the States. Donald Trump won the election. There's a sort of racist brand of populism that's really taking off. And I think there have been sort of individual specific victories. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is very important and I wouldn't say is the same thing as privilege politics at all. I think these are different things. But I think what's happened is there's been this kind of cultural emphasis on this awareness and sensitivity that's been just enough to rile these sort of right-wing populists, but that hasn't actually changed things on the ground. And I would like to believe that things were moving overall in a more sensitive and accepting direction, and maybe they are in Canada. I hope so, because I live here now also. But in the States, it's hard for me to look at what's going on and think that the discovery of a privilege, sort of that framing things in terms of privilege, has led to a more just society. Because that's really, I think, what it comes down to in the end is, has talking about privilege specifically moved things forward? And I'm not convinced it has.
So if not privilege, what framework would you like to see to take its place?
Well, so I think it's better to talk about oppression than to talk about privilege, because the aim should always be raising everyone up rather than, so to talk about something like police brutality, I think it's certainly, I don't fault anyone for using the expression privilege to talk about it, but I think it's not a privilege to be not brutalized by, it shouldn't be a privilege. So basically, I think using a term like oppression is a way of emphasizing that it shouldn't be a privilege not to be attacked by police officers. I think that would be one way I would want to change the discussion. And also just being more specific. So I think an expression like check your privilege or your privilege is showing can just be too vague, and the person who hears it won't necessarily know sort of either what they're being told or what to do. So I think if somebody says something, let's say sexist, you say, well, that was sexist, or that was racist, or that was homophobic, and then at least the person you're talking to knows, and it doesn't shift. I think the problem with something like check your privilege is it shifts the conversation into this one about somebody's inner life, which is just sort of futile and a sinkhole, and it's better to just talk about the world beyond that.
Do you think that people just need to be more educated about what privilege means?
Well, I think people need to be more educated about society's structure, and a little less focused on privilege specifically in the sense of individuals' cluelessness. I think cluelessness is unfortunately, but forever, a fact of life. I think people should, like individual cluelessness about everybody's going to be limited by their own experiences. I think there should be more understanding of how society is structured and where justice is needed. And that's where the focus should be.
Phoebe, thank you so much for being here and helping
Thanks,
us to
Sam.
understand a word that seems really simple, but it's also very complicated and needs a lot to be unpacked. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.